The orbital guns were dead. The distress beacons had been silent for 80 days. Below the burning skies of New Jericho, 3 million souls huddled in the dark, waiting for the alien executioners to finish the job. They thought humanity had abandoned them. They were dead wrong. The command center of Outpost Bradley smelled of ozone, stale sweat, and despair. Commander Robert Hayes stood over the tactical holotable, watching the red icons of the Drexian Armada swarm the blue sphere of New Jericho like parasites on a dying host. There were over 300 enemy vessels in high orbit, their silhouettes jagged and predatory against the stars. Below them, the colony's automated defense grid, once a state-of-the-art network designed by Lockheed Martin's Aerospace Division, was reduced to a handful of flickering green dots. "Grid Sector 7 just went dark, Commander," said Lieutenant Amanda Foster, her voice tight but remarkably steady for a 22-year-old who hadn't slept in 3 days. She wiped a streak of soot from her forehead, her eyes glued to the telemetry monitors. "That was the last of the heavy kinetic batteries. We have no orbital anti-ship capabilities left." Hayes leaned his weight on the edge of the metal table, the joints in his armored suit protesting with a mechanical whine. "What about the secondary communications array on Mount Mitchell? Has Peterson got it online yet?" "Negative, sir. The Drexian jamming is too thick. Even if Engineer Peterson patches the physical uplinks, we're trying to scream through a concrete wall." The siege had lasted exactly 81 days. New Jericho was supposed to be a shining jewel of human expansion, an agricultural and mining hub 50 light-years from Earth. But when the Drex arrived, a relentless, militaristic species that viewed human expansion as an infestation, they hadn't asked for surrender. They had simply started glassing the Northern Hemisphere. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the bunker, broken only by the hum of failing generators. It was then that the blast doors hissed open, and Governor Harrison Cole marched in. Cole was a man whose expensive tailored suit now looked absurd, covered in dust and sweat. He was a politician, a former corporate liaison for the mining conglomerates back on Earth, and Hayes despised him. "Commander, I demand to know why the civilian evacuation transports haven't been prepped for launch," Cole barked, his face flushed. Hayes didn't even look up from the map. "Because if we launch them, the Drex cruisers will shoot them out of the sky before they hit the stratosphere. We've been over this, Governor. We are holding the line here until Earth forces arrive." "Earth isn't coming," Cole shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "We are 50 light-years out. Even if they heard us, a United Nations naval deployment would take months to mobilize and jump. We are on our own, Hayes. You need to negotiate a surrender." Hayes finally turned, his expression cold and hard as depleted uranium. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his towering frame dwarfing the politician. "The Drex don't take prisoners, Harrison. You saw what they did to the colonists at the Bradbury settlement. They butchered them." Hayes paused, his eyes narrowing. "And Earth would have known we were under attack a month earlier if someone hadn't intentionally delayed sending the Priority 1 distress signal." Cole paled, taking a step back. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Hayes growled, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Engineer Peterson found the override logs in the primary comms array before it was destroyed. You locked down the deep space transmitters when the Drex first entered the system. You thought they were United Nations inspectors coming to audit your illegal lithium extraction operations. You blocked the signal to cover your own tracks, and by the time you realized they were hostile, the array was blown to hell." The command center went dead quiet. Lieutenant Foster stared at the governor with undisguised disgust. Before Cole could stammer a defense, the primary radio console erupted with harsh, roaring static. A voice punched through the interference, breathless and strained. "Command! Commander Hayes! This is Peterson." Hayes lunged for the comms unit. "Peterson! Sit rep! Do you have the array online?" "I bypassed the shattered conduits, sir." Peterson coughed violently over the channel, the unmistakable sound of wet lungs. "I had to manually route the power core through the transmission spire. The Drex drones. They found me. I took shrapnel to the chest, but the distress beacon is primed." "Listen to me, Samuel," Hayes said, gripping the edge of the console, his knuckles turning white. "Step away from the core. If you initiate the pulse manually, the radiation feedback will cook you alive." "If I don't do it manually, the jamming will block it," Peterson replied, his voice fading but resolute. "I'm locking the coordinates. Burst transmission, tight beam toward the Sol system. Tell my wife. Tell her I held the line." "Peterson, wait." A deafening roar of static shrieked through the speakers, followed by a massive power spike on the telemetry screens. On the tactical map, a brilliant white line of data pierced straight through the red swarm of Drex ships, tearing into the void of slipspace. The signal was away, but Peterson's life sign flatlined on the biometric monitor. Hayes stood in silence for a long moment. Then he turned to two armed military police officers standing by the blast doors. "Arrest Governor Cole for high treason and lock him in the brig. If we survive this, he faces a firing squad." As Cole was dragged away screaming, Hayes looked back at the tactical map. The signal was out, but the horrifying reality remained. Help was months away, and they only had hours left. The Drex orbital bombardment was stopping. The red icons were shifting, descending into the atmosphere. The ground invasion was beginning. The sky above Sector 4 was no longer a sky. It was a swirling vortex of ash, burning plasma, and descending alien drop pods. Sergeant Mitchell Collins crouched behind the shattered remains of a reinforced concrete barricade, clutching his standard-issue General Dynamics pulse rifle. His armor was scarred, his helmet cracked, and his breathing labored. Around him, the remnants of the 104th Infantry Regiment were dug into the ruins of what used to be the Planetary Financial District. "Check your targets! Short, controlled bursts!" Collins roared over the deafening cacophony of war, his voice augmented by his suit's external speakers. 80 yards down the ruined avenue, the Drex infantry advanced. They were terrifying to behold, bipedal, towering over 7 feet tall, with thick, chitinous armor plating that deflected standard kinetic rounds like raindrops. They carried heavy plasma cannons that fired searing spheres of green energy, melting steel and flesh with equal ease. To Collins's right, Private Jonathan Briggs was laying down suppressing fire with an automated heavy machine gun. "Sergeant, they're flanking us through the subway tunnels. We don't have the manpower to plug the gap." "Fall back to phase line, Charlie," Collins ordered, firing a barrage of pulse rounds that caught a Drex warrior in its unarmored joint, sending it crashing into the rubble. "Foster, detonate the charges on the bridge." Corporal Amanda Foster, bleeding from a superficial plasma burn on her shoulder, slammed her fist onto the remote detonator. A massive explosion rocked the avenue. 3,000 pounds of military-grade C4, rigged to the structural supports of the transit overpass, detonated simultaneously. The massive concrete structure groaned, buckled, and collapsed in a thunderous avalanche of debris, crushing 24 Drex warriors beneath thousands of tons of rock and steel. It bought them perhaps 3 minutes. Collins and his squad scrambled backward through the ash-choked streets, retreating toward the massive titanium blast doors of Bunker Primus, where the civilian population was sheltered. The air was so thick with smoke that Collins had to rely entirely on his suit's infrared sensors to see. "Command, this is Collins," he shouted into his comms, ducking as a green plasma bolt vaporized the burnt-out chassis of a civilian hovercar near his head. "We are falling back to the bunker gates. Ammo is critical. Casualties are at 70%. We cannot hold them much longer." Commander Hayes's voice cracked through the earpiece, sounding impossibly tired. "Copy that, Sergeant. Dig in at the gates. We have nowhere left to retreat. If they breach the bunker doors, 3 million people die. Hold the line, Collins. Just hold the line." Collins cut the channel. He looked at his squad. Briggs was hyperventilating, his hands shaking as he slammed a fresh thermal clip into his weapon. Foster was pale, biting her lip to fight the pain of her burn. They were just kids, really. Colonists who had signed up for a peaceful life, farming terraformed soil, now thrust into the meat grinder of an interstellar war. "Listen up," Collins barked, forcing a confidence he didn't feel into his voice. "We hold this ramp. Nobody gets past us. You fight for the person next to you, and you fight for the people in that bunker. Fix bayonets. Prime your last grenades." The dust cloud at the end of the street began to part. The Drex were adapting. Instead of infantry, they brought forward a siege breaker, a massive quadrupedal biomechanical tank bristling with heavy artillery. Its central plasma cannon began to glow with a blinding, radioactive green light, charging up for a shot that would blow the bunker doors off their hinges. "Target that walker!" Collins screamed, but he knew it was futile. Their small arms would only scratch its paint. The siege breaker leveled its cannon at the blast doors. The whine of its capacitors reached a deafening pitch. Collins closed his eyes, bracing for the end. Suddenly, a shock wave hit them. It wasn't an explosion. It was a pressure wave that sucked the air out of the street, making everyone's ears pop painfully. The ash and smoke in the air were violently blown away, as if a hurricane had just spawned in the middle of the city. The Drex siege breaker hesitated, its cannon powering down as its sensors detected something impossible. "Sergeant," Foster whispered, pointing at the sky. Collins looked up. The thick, polluted clouds covering New Jericho were being ripped apart in a perfect, glowing circle. The atmospheric pressure dropped dramatically. In the command bunker, Commander Hayes stared at the holotable in absolute shock. The orbital sensors, which had been tracking the Drex fleet, were suddenly overwhelmed by a colossal spike in gravitational energy. "Lieutenant," Hayes breathed, "what am I looking at? Is that a Drex superweapon?" "No, sir," Foster replied, her hands flying across the console, tears streaming down her face as the data decoded. "The mass profile, the slipspace signature, it's human. Commander, it's the United Nations Starfleet, but the mass reading is off the charts. It's too big." Back on the surface, Collins watched as the sky literally tore open. A slipspace rupture, a swirling vortex of blue and violet light expanded in the upper atmosphere, and then the ship descended. It didn't glide. It didn't maneuver. It dropped out of the void like an anvil cast from heaven. It was a dreadnought, easily 5 miles long, its hull forged from pitch-black armor plating and bristling with railguns the size of skyscrapers. Emblazoned on its side in massive white lettering was the name UNS Admiral Halsey. As the warship entered the lower atmosphere, the friction of its descent created a sonic boom so powerful it shattered every remaining pane of glass in the city. The Drex siegebreaker aimed its cannon at the descending Leviathan, a pathetic gesture of defiance. The human dreadnought didn't even bother charging a plasma weapon. From its underside, a massive kinetic bombardment battery rotated downward, a single solid slug of tungsten weighing 3 tons and accelerating to Mach 20, was fired. The impact struck the Drex Walker dead center. The kinetic force evaporated the machine in a blinding flash of white light, leaving a crater 50 feet deep where the alien tank had stood. Collins lowered his rifle, his jaw slack. From the belly of the warship, hundreds of drop pods began to rain down upon the city like angry steel meteors. They thought no aid was coming. But humanity had heard the call, and they had brought hell with them. The drop pods struck the shattered pavement of New Jericho with the force of localized earthquakes. Each cylindrical pod, forged by the metallurgy divisions of Northrop Grumman from hyperdense titanium alloys, buried itself 3 feet deep into the concrete and asphalt. For a terrifying, breathless second, the battlefield fell completely silent. The Drex warriors, bred for centuries in the art of relentless slaughter, paused. They had never seen an orbital insertion performed with such suicidal velocity. Then the explosive bolts on the pods blew simultaneously. The heavy steel doors kicked outward, creating a cloud of pressurized vapor and dust. From the smoke emerged the mechanized infantry of the United Nations Starfleet. They were the first orbital drop division, and they did not look like standard soldiers. They were encased in hulking, 8-foot-tall powered exoskeletons, the Raytheon Mark IV Goliath suits. The armor was a matte, radar-absorbent black, scarred by atmospheric re-entry and bristling with heavy ordnance. Sergeant Mitchell Collins remained crouched behind the rubble, his pulse rifle lowered as he watched the colossal metal titans step into the fray. "Holy Mother of God," Corporal Foster whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The lead Goliath suit, designated by a pair of white chevrons painted on its massive shoulder pauldron, did not issue a vocal command. Instead, a localized tactical network pulsed through the comms of every surviving local infantryman, overriding the Drex jamming frequencies with sheer, brute force signal strength. "Local forces, this is Captain James Reynolds, UNS Marine Corps." A deep, heavily filtered voice rumbled through Collins's earpiece. "Keep your heads down. We will take the aggro." Before Collins could even acknowledge the transmission, the Goliaths opened fire. They carried rotary rail cannons, weapons typically mounted on light armored vehicles, now being wielded like standard rifles. The magnetic coils spun up with a deafening shriek, unleashing a torrent of depleted uranium slugs at 5,000 rounds per minute. The Drex front line, which had terrorized Collins's squad for hours, simply evaporated. The chitinous armor of the alien infantry, impervious to standard kinetic rounds, shattered like glass under the heavy railgun fire. Green blood and severed limbs painted the ruined financial district as the Goliaths marched forward in perfect, unyielding synchronization. "Push the line!" Captain Reynolds ordered. A Drex heavy weapons specialist leveled its plasma cannon at Reynolds's suit, firing a searing bolt of green energy. The plasma struck the Goliath squarely in the chest. Collins flinched, expecting the armor to melt. Instead, the suit's ablative thermal plating, an experimental ceramic mesh designed by Boston Dynamics, flared bright orange, dispersing the heat across the chassis. The armor smoked, but Reynolds didn't even break his stride. He raised his left arm, where a mounted micro-missile pod locked onto the Drex specialist, and fired. The resulting explosion reduced the alien to ash. Up in the command bunker, Commander Robert Hayes watched the telemetry feed with a grim, tight-lipped satisfaction. The green dots representing human forces were pushing a massive wave of red icons away from Bunker Primus. But the battle was far from over. "Commander, Lieutenant Amanda Foster called out, her voice snapping Hayes back to the strategic overview. She wasn't looking at the ground engagement. She was looking at the orbital tracking monitors. The UNS Admiral Halsey is taking heavy fire in the upper atmosphere. The Drex fleet has reorganized. They're converging on the dreadnought. Hayes quickly switched the central holotable to the orbital feed. The Halsey was a beast of a ship, but it was currently outnumbered 300 to 1. The Drex cruisers had formed a spherical blockade around the dreadnought, raining a relentless storm of plasma torpedoes and directed energy beams against its hull. "Why hasn't the Halsey activated its secondary shielding?" Hayes muttered, leaning closer to the glowing blue hologram of the human warship. "They're taking those hits on their physical armor plating. It won't hold." "Sir, I'm reading a massive power diversion on the Halsey," Foster said, her fingers flying across the console to decode the telemetry. "They aren't powering shields. They are routing all of their antimatter reactor output to the ventral gravity well projectors. Commander, they are intentionally anchoring themselves in the low atmosphere." "Why would they anchor? They're sitting ducks," Hayes said, his tactical mind racing to understand the dreadnought's suicidal play. Suddenly, a new voice cut into the command center's encrypted channel. It was crisp, aristocratic, and remarkably calm given the circumstances. "Outpost Bradley. This is Fleet Admiral Thomas Sterling of the UNS Halsey," the voice said. "Apologies for our tardiness. We received your distress beacon, courtesy of Engineer Peterson's brave sacrifice. I see you have a bit of a pest problem." "Admiral Sterling," Hayes replied, standing at attention out of pure reflex. "Sir, you are completely surrounded. We appreciate the orbital drop, but your vessel is taking catastrophic damage. You need to break atmosphere and initiate evasive maneuvers." "Negative, Commander Hayes," Admiral Sterling replied smoothly. "We are exactly where we intend to be. We are acting as a gravitational anchor to keep the slipspace rupture open in New Jericho's atmosphere." Hayes stared at the holotable in confusion. "Keep the rupture open?" "Sir, slipspace physics dictates that a rupture collapses seconds after a ship exits. You can't hold a tear in space-time open." "You can, Commander, if you have a ship big enough to act as a doorstop," Sterling said, a hint of dark amusement in his tone. "And the Halsey isn't here to fight the Drex fleet. We are here to hold the door." On the tactical map, the massive gravitational anomaly that had brought the Halsey into the system flared with blinding intensity. The slipspace rupture, which should have faded, suddenly expanded tenfold. "Commander," Foster gasped, pointing at the screen. "Multiple slipspace signatures detected. Mass readings they're off the scale." The sky above New Jericho roared as the true might of humanity finally arrived. The ash-choked sky above the city of New Jericho was torn completely asunder. The dark, swirling vortex of the slipspace rupture expanded until it dominated the entire horizon, glowing with an intense, violent violet light. The Drex fleet, previously focused on bombarding the Halsey, ceased their fire. Their sensors, operating on cold, algorithmic logic, detected the incoming mass and immediately registered an unwinnable scenario. First came the destroyers. Sleek, jagged vessels built for pure speed and flanking maneuvers, pouring out of the rift by the dozens. They immediately broke formation, scattering into the atmosphere like a swarm of angry hornets, their point defense lasers tearing through the smaller Drex fighters with surgical precision. Then came the cruisers, massive, heavily armored warships bearing the insignias of Earth's most powerful corporate military coalitions. There were vessels from the European defense conglomerate, heavy carriers from the Pan-Asian Navy, and the brutal, blocky artillery ships of the North American Aerospace Command. But it was the command ships that finally broke the Drex Armada's resolve. 3 supercarriers, each dwarfing even the Admiral Halsey, slid slowly out of the void. They were floating cities of titanium and fury. As they entered the atmosphere, they didn't bother with conventional plasma weapons. They unleashed MACs, magnetic accelerator cannons. From the ground, Sergeant Collins watched in stunned silence as the sky lit up with blinding streaks of white light. Each streak was a tungsten projectile, moving at a fraction of the speed of light. The Drex orbital cruisers were struck with such devastating kinetic force that they didn't even explode. They simply shattered, their hulls turning into molten slag and metallic dust in a microsecond. "Good Lord!" Captain Reynolds's voice echoed over the ground comms, the hardened ODST commander sounding genuinely awestruck. The Admiralty sent the entire First Fleet. In the ruins of the financial district, the surviving Drex ground forces looked up at the sky. For a species that knew no fear, that had conquered a dozen star systems through sheer, unfeeling brutality, they suddenly experienced the crushing weight of their own mortality. Their fleet was being systematically dismantled. The debris of their destroyed warships began to rain down upon the outskirts of the city like a fiery meteor shower. With their orbital support annihilated, the Drex infantry broke. "They're retreating!" Corporal Foster yelled, raising her pulse rifle. The towering alien warriors were falling back, abandoning their heavy siege weapons and scrambling toward their landing zones. "Do not let them regroup!" Captain Reynolds roared, his Goliath suit surging forward, its heavy mechanical servos whining with exertion. "Push them into the kill zones! Artillery, bring the rain!" The human dreadnoughts in low orbit adjusted their secondary batteries. Pinpoint orbital strikes began to hammer the Drex retreat paths. Pillars of searing blue energy punched through the clouds, instantly vaporizing entire columns of the alien infantry. The ground shook violently, the shockwaves knocking Collins and his squad off their feet. But they cheered. For the first time in 81 days, the humans of New Jericho were cheering. Back in the command center of Outpost Bradley, the oppressive silence of impending doom had been replaced by a chaotic, euphoric frenzy. Technicians were crying, hugging each other, and shouting tactical updates as the human fleet secured the airspace. Commander Hayes stood by the holotable, watching the red icons of the Drex forces vanish one by one, replaced by a sea of triumphant blue. He exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for 3 months. His hands, gripping the edge of the metal console, were shaking slightly. The primary comms channel beeped. "Commander Hayes, this is Fleet Admiral Sterling," the voice came through, clear and crisp. "The airspace is secure. Ground forces are mopping up the remaining Drex stragglers. We are deploying medical frigates and engineering corps to your location now." "Thank you, Admiral," Hayes said, his voice thick with emotion. "We thought Earth had abandoned us. The silence was deafening." "Earth never abandons her own, Commander," Sterling replied softly. "But we have a matter of internal security to discuss. Intelligence recovered a fragmented data log from your comms array before we jumped. It seems your planetary distress beacon was intentionally sabotaged during the initial invasion." Hayes's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the reinforced door of the brig. "Yes, sir. Governor Harrison Cole. He locked down the transmitters to hide an illegal corporate mining operation. He cost millions of lives to protect his profit margins." "I see," Sterling said, his voice losing all warmth, replaced by the cold, calculating tone of a military executioner. "Secure the governor. I am sending a detachment of military police to take him into custody. He will be tried for treason against the United Nations, and I assure you, the penalty will be absolute." Understood, Admiral. Outpost Bradley. Signing off. Hayes cut the channel. He turned away from the hollow table and looked out the reinforced observation window of the bunker. The thick, polluted ash that had choked the sky for months was finally beginning to clear, blown away by the atmospheric displacement of the massive human fleet hovering above. Sunlight pierced through the clouds, illuminating the ruined, smoking city of New Jericho. It was battered, broken, and scarred by fire. But as Hayes watched a squadron of human dropships descend gracefully toward the medical triage tents, he knew one thing for certain. The city would rebuild. The colony would survive. And the rest of the galaxy now knew exactly what happens when you awaken the sleeping giant of Earth. They had thought no aid was coming. They had thought humanity was weak. They were dead wrong. The sheer firepower of the United Nations, Starfleet, proves one universal truth. You never back humanity into a corner. If you loved seeing the mighty Halsey hold the line and the First Fleet shatter the Drex Armada, smash that like button right now. Share this epic HFY story with your friends, and make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more thrilling sci-fi tales. What was your favorite tactical maneuver in this battle? Let us know in the comments below.